Hello, and welcome to the Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council's new internet show on the most pressing issues impacting transatlantic relations today. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. I am so thrilled to welcome a very special guest to the show today, the U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith. Ambassador Smith, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. So we just have about 20 minutes, so I want to get right into it. You happen to be in this role as the U.S. ambassador to NATO at one of the most consequential times in history, one could argue. With the war in Ukraine, NATO's new strategic concept adopted at the Madrid summit in June, NATO's focus on China, new and emerging technologies, enlarging to include Finland and Sweden. We could probably have this conversation for an hour, but I want to jump right into talking about what is on all of our minds today, which is the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I think what's interesting is that we've seen immense bilateral support, both in military support, humanitarian aid, financial aid, going from NATO countries to Ukraine. But this is also a much broader conversation that NATO as a whole is having. You know, NATO really doesn't own that much kit itself, so it's sort of limited in what it as an alliance with soon to be 32 members can do. So how is NATO thinking about the way it's changed over the last 7 or 8 months, and how is it planning its support for Ukraine going forward?
Well, first of all, I'd say there has been a lot of change here across the NATO alliance since the war started. I mean, first and foremost, the alliance has moved a very high number of forces into Eastern Europe to reinforce the eastern flank. So putting into practice all of the commitments that allies have made over the years and showing how we can actually activate the graduated response plans or how we can activate elements of the NATO response force, all of that came to the fore on the morning of February 24th when Russia went into Ukraine. Simultaneously, we spend an enormous amount of time here talking about the war in Ukraine and thinking about what role NATO has to play. On the one hand, you're right. NATO has fundamentally decided that it will take every step it can to ensure that it's not party to the conflict. But on the other hand, this is the place where we're building unity, working on the resolve, pushing countries individually to do everything they can to support the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian forces. It was here at NATO where we've shared an unprecedented level of intelligence with our allies that helped us all get on the same page to understand what Russia was about to do. And you'll remember before Russia went into Ukraine, this was where we actually held the first NATO-Russia Council in many years with the Russians to try and identify some sort of diplomatic off-ramp. Tragically, that didn't stop the Russians from going into Ukraine. But just to give you an example that NATO has been a big piece of this even before the war started. In terms of the way forward, I think allies are united in their view that we have to do everything we can individually to help those Ukrainian forces succeed on the ground. But we remain united also in the view that we are not going to become party to the conflict.
Absolutely. You mentioned over the last few months sort of the unity that NATO has been able to show, and I thought that was really on display at the Madrid summit in June. NATO adopted a new strategic concept for the first time in 12 years. The last strategic concept, written in 2010, was woefully out of date. It talked about Russia as a strategic partner. It didn't mention China a single time. So talk to us a little bit about that new strategic concept and how NATO is operationalizing aspects of it over the last few months and how it's planning on that going forward. You've said that it's meant to last years, not just weeks or months.
That's right. So for folks that aren't aware, this is essentially NATO's mission statement, and it's something that NATO rewrites every 10 years or so. In this case, we really hadn't done it in 12 years, as you noted. It was last drafted in 2010. And if you compare the two documents, the one from 2010 and the one from 2022, you see major changes. You see a significant shift in how we talk about Russia. Russia is described as a threat. NATO openly states in the strategic concept that Russia is no longer a partner to this alliance. That's a big change in our policy towards Russia. But you also noted that China was included in the strategic concept for the first time. The Indo-Pacific, mention of the relationship between China and Russia. Those are all new developments that reflect the world that we find ourselves living in. And on top of it, the strategic concept mentions a whole array of new challenges for which the alliance believes it should be preparing itself. And those challenges include everything from cybersecurity to emerging and disruptive technologies to climate security, a whole variety of transnational challenges. We talk about the importance of women, peace, and security. That's another theme in the strategic concept. So your question is the right one. Now that the alliance has laid out this very ambitious statement for itself that will hopefully hold for many years to come, how do you now execute and implement on that good strategic document to take it from strategy to actual policies? And that's what we're going to be spending the weeks and months ahead, years doing, trying to take that language on China. Okay, we all have an appreciation of the challenge that China is posing to the rules-based order. What is NATO going to do about it? How will it build resilience? How will it build better hybrid tools or tools to counter hybrid tactics? How is NATO going to operate in new domains like space? So this is all the work that sits before us, but we're going to have to be, in some ways, flying the jet and building it at the same time. We're in the middle of a huge land war in Europe. We're obviously, as noted at the top, spending a lot of time on Ukraine and Russia's war of aggression, but we also have to take time to execute on everything that was outlined in the strategic concept. So we have a lot ahead of us. We're not short on things to do around here at NATO headquarters, but I'm confident that the most important piece, the strategic concept that lays out the agenda, is done, and now we can get to the details of implementing it.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the resilience piece? Because I think that's really interesting. We've seen hybrid attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines just recently. We're seeing increased cyber attacks for NATO countries. And, you know, the goal is for NATO countries to be able to insulate themselves from these hybrid type attacks, new and emerging types of warfare. So how is the alliance thinking about resilience, and what changes do you think it needs to make going forward?
Well, if you read the strategic concept, you actually see the word resilience pop up quite a few times. And I think right now, when we think about our future deterrence and defense posture, which was also a big component of the new strategic concept, resilience is part of that, building resilience to deal with either conventional challenges or hybrid challenges or challenges associated with what China is doing in and around the Euro-Atlantic area. And resilience can mean different things. I mean, part of it is societal resilience. What more can NATO do so that we can build resilience, for example, in the area of critical infrastructure, so that in the future, if an actor is looking to do harm to critical infrastructure on alliance territory, have we taken the right steps or built in the right measures that will enable us to keep moving forward, either in our defense of NATO territory or in our deterrence posture? And so resilience is a theme that will run through much of the work that I just outlined. Resilience will be a part of our cybersecurity work. Resilience will be a part of our work on energy security. It will also play a key role on critical infrastructure. So I think you're going to hear a lot more about about this. I think it's also part of the U.S. national defense strategy. This is a theme that you also see emerge in the U.S. national security strategy. And that's something that hopefully the United States can work with allies to bring some of those lessons and ideas into the alliance, again, in the months ahead.
I want to ask you a little bit more about China. One of the refrains that you often hear from people in the US and other countries is that the Indo-Pacific really isn't the region that NATO should be focusing on, that it should focus on Europe. That's where its efforts need to be focused on. And the Indo-Pacific is for the United States and for other multilateral forums. But Secretary General Stoltenberg has made it clear that these discussions on China are not about pushing NATO into the Indo-Pacific region. Rather, it's responding to China's many different types of inroads throughout Europe. So, what do you think are what do you think the role of NATO is in the Indo-Pacific region, and how do you sort of respond to people who are saying this is not what NATO really should be focusing on right now?
Well, I have heard that refrain. I've heard some folks in Europe talk about the fact that there's a perception that perhaps the United States or NATO allies or the NATO Secretary General has some sort of interest in NATO moving out into the Asia Pacific with either defense capabilities or building out relationships. And I think certainly when it comes to building out relationships and engagement, the answer is a resounding yes. But no one here at NATO, including the United States, is suggesting that the alliance somehow send all of its, say, naval capabilities off into the South China Sea. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, first and foremost, acknowledging the nature of the challenge. And that is both China and Russia are fundamentally doing their very best to challenge what we collectively hold dear. And by we, I mean those like-minded democracies in the Indo-Pacific that increasingly find utility in developing relationships with allies here in Europe. If you read the recent national security strategy, there's a really interesting section it's worth taking a look at it. About the United States finding ways to bridge the gap between its Pacific allies and its Atlantic allies. And there, NATO's already done a lot of work. Just this spring, we had a foreign ministerial where we had 4 Asia-Pacific nations at the table. Following that, in Madrid at the summit, we had those same nations, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, join us at the NATO summit. Now, why are we doing that? We're doing that because we believe that it's important to, one, share lessons with these countries. What lessons have we all learned in dealing with disinformation challenges or cybersecurity challenges or attempts by the Chinese to erode our technological edge? How can we learn from one another? Secondly, how can we map out some sort of roadmap for each other to deepen our engagement and develop, if not exactly the same policy in certain areas, complementary policies as it relates to some of these hybrid tactics that all of us are increasingly encountering. And the fundamental purpose here is to bring together like-minded allies so that we can strengthen our collective hand in our ability to counter some of what Russia and China are doing to either divide us or challenge our value system and our democratic systems, full stop. So NATO already finds real utility in these engagements. I think you're going to see more innovation in this regard in the months ahead. And I do think this is just going to be part of the NATO family going forward.
Thank you. Another major development in Madrid was the decision to invite Finland and Sweden to join the alliance. You know, they have been historically militarily neutral, and after Russia's invasion, there was a vast change and swift change in public opinion on whether or not Sweden and Finland should join NATO. But they haven't joined yet. We're still waiting on Turkey to ratify their accession into the alliance. And so I'm wondering what that conversation looks like there. Are you hopeful that this is going to happen sometime soon? I think we're also waiting for Hungary, if I'm not mistaken. But that should happen, I think, on the 24th. But we'll see.
Well, so a couple of things there. So first and foremost, the good news is we've seen a very swift ratification process by 28 members of the alliance, really lightning speed. We've rarely seen anything like this. Just in a few months' time, to have 28 members of the alliance complete the ratification process has been nothing short of remarkable, and I think says a lot about alliance unity on this question. You're right to note that there are two countries that have yet to ratify. That's both Hungary and Turkey. I will wait and see how things unfold in the weeks ahead with Hungary. They have been reassuring in their public posturing on this, and we'll have to take them at their word. And we'll see how that unfolds this fall. And Turkey, as you well know, came in early and had their hand up and said, we have some concerns, we have some objections, and we want to talk about those before we move forward with ratification. We don't know how long it's going to take to complete the ratification process at 30. We obviously hope that it's done sooner rather than later. But the good news here is that this alliance has 73 years of experience of coping with situations where one or two or three allies have concerns or want to slow a process down, and we get through it. And so if you ask me if I'm confident that we will get there, absolutely, we will. Sweden and Finland will become members of the alliance, but I cannot say with any certainty the exact date when that might occur. But what we're doing right now is continuing to applaud the three countries, particularly Turkey, Finland, and Sweden. They've come together many times, both up in the neighborhood of Stockholm and Helsinki, but also in Ankara, to have conversations trilaterally to address some of the concerns. And I think, frankly, those have been constructive.
Absolutely. Well, we're all hopeful, and we're all crossing our fingers that it happens sometime soon. One last question. You were at the Berlin Policy Forum this past week, and the moderator for your conversation asked you to describe in one word how you see the NATO alliance 5 years from now, and your word was strong. But you also mentioned that you don't have a crystal ball, that there's really no telling what will happen in the United States over the next few years. And I'm sure that that's a concern that many NATO allies and allies more broadly throughout Europe concern as well. And so I'm wondering what that conversation looks like at NATO, and how are countries concerned about what happens to the United States in the next few years, and what steps are allies taking to sort of shield themselves against a potential change in administration that might bring with it some potentially anti-European policies?
Well, the reality is that, unfortunately, you're right, we don't have a crystal ball, and it's hard to predict how politics will affect the NATO alliance, either from our side of the Atlantic, or actually your side where you sit right now, or this side of the Atlantic in Europe. And the focus for all of us, therefore, must be on a pretty simple mission, and that is to ensure that this alliance is as strong as ever. And we're doing that right now by getting the strategic concept right, by continuing to push allies to meet their defense investment pledge commitments, meet the 2% of GDP spending, defense spending goal, and also to deliver on our deterrence and defense posture. You know, here at NATO, we're undertaking so many different steps right now to change the ways in which we plan, the ways in which we move posture around We prepare to have rapidly deployable forces. We're focused on combat credible forces. We're going to be making changes to what we call the new force model. So really, any way you shake it, from strategy all the way down to the toolkit that NATO has, to what individual steps NATO members are taking, I think we've got a good news story at every level. And I think what that does is that enables this alliance to move forward, carry forward with its mission, carry forward with meeting new challenges, and weather any storms that might come its way, either because of domestic politics amongst one of its members or more, but also a change in the threat environment. So this year, I am quite confident that we're going to look back on 2022 as a pivotal moment for the alliance, when it is getting all of the different pieces lined up to be fit for the future. And that's been our mission since I arrived here. And that is what I'm going to focus on for my remaining time here at NATO headquarters.
Absolutely. Well, there's no shortage of issues to work on. But I don't think that anyone could think of a more better person to have in the position of U.S. NATO ambassador than you. So thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and for this rich discussion. I'm really looking forward to getting this posted, and people are going to learn a lot watching it. So Ambassador Smith, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Rachel.